5 days. The sound of the tractor did not necessarily mean that Mr. Fitzgibbon was getting ready to plow. He used it for many other things, hauling hay and firewood, for instance, and mowing and clearing snow in the winter. Mrs. Frisby reminded herself of all this as she hurried over to the corner post. That was a very thick fence post at the corner of the garden nearest the farmhouse and the tractor shed. She had discovered, long ago, that it had, a few inches above the ground, a convenient knot hole with a hollow place behind it in which she could hide, when she had reason to, and watch what was going on in the yard. The cat, Dragon, also knew of its existence, so she had to look sharply when she came out. She came up carefully behind the post, stared this way and that, and then darted around it and up into the hole. All clear. Mr. Fitzgibbon had backed the tractor out of the big, cluttered shed where he kept it, leaving the motor idling. He climbed down from the front seat and called to the house. In a moment, his older son, Paul, came out, closing the door carefully behind him. Paul, at 15, was a quiet, hard-working boy, rather clumsy in his movements, but strong and careful about his chores. In a few seconds, he was followed by his younger brother, Billy, who at age 12 was noisier and had an annoying habit of skimming rocks across the grass at anything that moved. Mrs. Frisby did not much care for Billy.
"All right, boys,"
said Mr. Fitzgibbon.
"let's haul it out and see about that linchpin."
"It was just about worn through last fall, I remember," Paul said. The boys disappeared into the shed, and Mr. Fitzgibbon remounted the tractor. He turned it around and backed it slowly toward the shed so that the rear end was out of Mrs. Frisby's sight. There was some clanking and clanging inside the shed while Mr. Fitzgibbon, looking over his shoulder, worked some levers on the side of the tractor. All set! He shifted gears and eased the tractor forward again. Hitched behind it, clear of the ground, was the plow. Mrs. Frisby's heart sank. Surely he was not going to start now. But as soon as he had the plow out in the sunlight, Mr. Fitzgibbon turned the tractor's engine off. It died with a sputter, and they all gathered around the plow hitch.
"Sure enough," said Mr. Fitzgibbon, "she's just about ready to shear. Paul, I'm glad you remembered that. If I order it today, Henderson's will have a new one in 3 or 4 days."
"It took 5 days last time," Paul said.
"5 then. That's just about right anyway. It's too wet to plow now, but 5 days like this ought to dry the ground out. Let's grease up while we've got it out. Billy, get the grease gun."
In her hiding place, Mrs. Frisby breathed a sigh of relief and then began to worry again immediately. 5 days, although a respite, was too short. 3 weeks, Mr. Ages had said, would be the soonest Timothy could get out of bed, the soonest he could live through a chill night without getting pneumonia again. She sighed and felt like weeping. If only the summer house were as warm as the cinder block house. But it was not, and even if it were, he could not make the long journey. They might try to carry him, but what was the use of that? Only to have him get sick again after the first night there? She might, she thought, go back to Mr. Ages and see if he had any ideas that would help. Was there some medicine that would make Timothy get strong sooner? She doubted it. Surely, if he had such medicine, he would have given it to her the first time. She was thinking about this when she climbed out through the knothole and slithered to the ground below, not 10 feet from the cat. Dragon lay stretched out in the sunlight, but he was not asleep. His head was up and his yellow eyes were open, staring in her direction. She gasped in terror and whirled around the fence post to put it between her and him. Then, without pausing, She set out on a dash across the garden as fast as she could run, expecting at any instant to hear the cat scream and feel his great claws on her back. She reached the shrew's hole and considered for a fraction of a second diving into it, but it was too small. Then she glanced back over her shoulder and saw an amazing sight. The cat had not moved at all. He was lying exactly as before, except that now one of his eyes was closed. The other, however, was still looking straight at her, so she did not pause, but raced on. Finally, when she was a safe distance away, 2/3 across the garden and nearly home, she stopped and looked again more carefully. The cat still lay there and seemed to have gone to sleep. That was so odd, so unheard of, she could hardly believe it. Feeling quite safe, but puzzled, she looked for a vantage point from which she could see better. By rights, she should be dead, and though she had escaped by what seemed almost a miracle, she scolded herself for having been so careless. If the cat had killed her, who would take care of the children? She saw a dead asparagus plant, stiff, tall, with branches like a small tree. She climbed it, and from near the top looked back to the farmyard. Mr. Fitzgibbon and his sons had finished greasing the tractor and gone on somewhere else. But the cat still lay on the grass, seemingly asleep. Why had he not chased her? Was it possible that, close as she had been, he had not seen her? She could not believe that. The only explanation she could think of was that he had just finished a very large meal and was feeling so stuffed and lazy he did not want to take the trouble to get up. But that was almost as unbelievable. Certainly it had never happened before. Was it possible that he was sick? Then, on what had already been a day of oddities and alarms, she noticed something else strange. Beyond the cat, quite far beyond, between the barn and the house, she saw what looked like a troop of dark gray figures marching in columns. Marching? Not exactly, but moving slowly and all in line. They were rats. There were a dozen of them, and at first she could not quite see what they were up to. Then she saw something moving between them and behind them. It looked like a thick piece of rope, a long piece, maybe 20 feet. No, it was stiffer than rope. It was electric cable, the heavy black kind used for outdoor wiring and strung on telephone poles. The rats were hauling it laboriously through the grass, inching it along the direction of a very large wild rose bush in the far corner of the yard. Mrs. Frisby quickly guessed where they were taking it, though she could not guess why. In that rose bush, concealed and protected by dense tangles of fiercely sharp thorns, was the entrance to a rat hole. All the animals knew about it and were careful to stay away. But what would the rats want with such a long piece of wire? Mrs. Frisby could not imagine. Even more curious, how did they dare to pull it across the yard in broad daylight when the cat was right there? The rats were bigger than Mrs. Frisby and could be, when necessary, dangerous fighters, but they were no match for Dragon. She watched them for quite a long time. It was obvious that they knew exactly what they were doing, and they looked as well drilled as a group of soldiers. They had about 25 yards to go to reach the rose bush. As if at a signal, which, however, she was too far away to hear, they would all pull together, moving the wire about a foot. Then they would pause, rest, and heave again. It was about 20 minutes before the first rat disappeared into the bush. A little later, the last bit of wire disappeared behind them like a thin black snake, and Mrs. Frisby climbed down from the asparagus bush. All that time, the cat had slept on. A favor from Jeremy. In her worry about moving day, in watching the tractor, the cat, and finally the rats, Mrs. Frisby had forgotten that she had set out originally to get some corn for supper. Now she remembered it, so instead of continuing to her house, she turned toward the far corner of the garden and the stump at the edge of the woods beyond. She was a little tired after her dash from the cat, so she walked along slowly, feeling the warmth of the sun and the smell of the breeze. This mild breeze, carrying the moist essence of early spring, caused a dead leaf to flutter here and there, and across the garden, near the fence, it moved something that sparkled in the sunlight. This caught the corner of Mrs. Frisby's eye. She glanced at it, saw that it was only a bit of tinfoil or aluminum foil, blown from somewhere, and she looked away again. Then she looked back, for at that moment a black object plummeted from the sky, and she recognized her friend Jeremy the Crow. A thought crossed Mrs. Frisby's mind. She changed direction again, and moving more quickly, ran across the earth to where Jeremy stood. He was hopping around the shiny piece of foil, eyeing it from one direction and another. What had occurred to Mrs. Frisby was that although Jeremy was not the brightest of animals she had met, and though he was young, he knew things and places she did not, and one had to begin somewhere. As she approached him, he had picked up the foil in his beak and was spreading his wings to fly off. "Wait, please," she called. He turned, folded his wings, and then replaced the foil carefully on the ground. "Hello," he said. "You remember me?" "Of course. You saved me from the cat." Then he added, "What do you think of this piece of foil?" Mrs. Frisby looked at it without much interest. "It's just a piece of foil," she said. "It's not very big." "True, but it's shiny, especially when the sun strikes it just so." "Why are you so interested in shiny things?" "Well, really, I'm not. At least, not very. But I have a friend who likes them, so when I see one, I pick it up." "I see. That's very thoughtful. And would the friend be female?" "As a matter of fact, yes, she is. How did you know?" "Just a guess," said Mrs. Frisby. "Do you remember saying once that if I needed help, I might ask you?" "I do, anytime. Just ask for Jeremy. Any of the crows can find me. And now, if you'll excuse me." He bent over to pick up the foil again. "Please don't go yet," said Mrs. Frisby. "I think perhaps you can help me now." "Ah," said Jeremy. "What kind of help? Are you hungry? I'll bring some seeds from the barn loft. I know where they're stored." "No, thank you," said Mrs. Frisby. "We have enough to eat." And then she told him, as briefly as she could, about Timothy, his sickness, and the problem of moving day. Jeremy knew about moving day. Crows do not have to move, but they keep a close watch on such activities as plowing and planting, so as to get their fair share of what's planted, and with their sharp eyes they see the small animals leaving before the plow. So he clucked sympathetically when he heard Mrs. Frisby's story, cocked his head to one side, and thought as hard as he could for as long as he could, which was about 30 seconds. His eyes closed with the effort. "I don't know what you should do," he said finally. "I'm sorry, but maybe I can help even so. At least I can tell you what we do when we don't know what to do." "We?" "The crows. Most of the birds." "What do you do then?" "Over that way." Jeremy nodded in the direction of the deep woods and faraway mountains that rose beyond the fence. "About a mile from here, there grows a very large beech tree, the biggest tree in the whole forest. Near the top of the tree, there is a hollow in the trunk. In the hollow lives an owl, who is the oldest animal in the woods, some say in the world. When we don't know what to do, we ask him. Sometimes he answers our questions. Sometimes he doesn't. It depends on how he feels. Or as my feather used to say, what kind of a humor he's in." Sorry. Or as my father used to say, what kind of a humor he's in. Or possibly, thought Mrs. Frisby, on whether or not he knows the answer. But she said, Could you ask him then if he knows of any help for me? She did not think it likely that he would.
Ah, no, Jeremy said. That won't do. That is, I could ask him, but I don't think the owl would listen. Imagine, a crow come to ask for help for a lady mouse with a sick child. He wouldn't believe me.
Then what's to be done?
What's to be done? You must go yourself and ask him.
But I could never find the tree, and if I did, I don't think I could climb so high.
Ah, now, that is where I can help. As I said I would. I'll carry you there on my back, the way I did before. And home again, of course.
Mrs. Frisby hesitated. It was one thing to leap on a crow's back when the cat is only 3 jumps away and coming fast, but quite another to do it deliberately, and to fly deep into a dark and unknown forest. In short, Mrs. Frisby was afraid. Then she thought of Timothy, and of the big steel plow blade. She told herself, I have no choice. If there is any chance that the owl might be able to help me, to advise me, I must go. She said to Jeremy, Thank you very much. I will go and talk to the owl, if you will take me. It's a great favor.
It's nothing, said Jeremy. You're welcome, but we can't go now.
Why not?
In the daytime, when the sun is out, the owl goes deep into the hollow and sleeps. That is, they say he sleeps, but I don't believe it. How could anyone sleep so long? I think he sits in there, part of the time at least, and thinks. And that's why he knows so much. But anyway, he won't speak in the daytime, not to anyone. And at night, he's out flying and hunting.
I know, said Mrs. Frisby, and that was another reason to be afraid.
The time to see him is just at dusk. Then, when the light gets dim, he comes to the entrance of the hollow and watches while the dark comes in. That's the time to ask him questions.
I understand, said Mrs. Frisby. Shall we go this evening?
At 5 o'clock, Jeremy said. I'll be at your house.
He picked up the piece of foil in his bill, waved goodbye, and flew off. The Owl. Jeremy appeared as promised when the last thumbnail of sun winked out over the mountains beyond the meadow. Mrs. Frisby was waiting, her heart pounding in her ears, and 3 of the children were there to watch, Teresa and Martin standing beside their mother, and Cynthia, who was afraid of the crow, just a pair of round eyes peering out the round doorway. Timothy was down below, taking a nap, and had not been told about the expedition lest he worry and blame himself for the risk his mother must take. Indeed, the words moving day had not been mentioned in his presence. Even to the other children, Mrs. Frisby had explained only a part of the problem. That is, she had not told them that there were only 5 days left, nor anything about Mr. Fitzgibbon and the tractor. She did not want them to worry either. Jeremy landed with a swoosh, a bit dramatically, perhaps, and nodded at the children and Mrs. Frisby.
Hello, he said. Here I am.
Mrs. Frisby introduced Martin and Teresa, and Cynthia's eyes. Martin, who wished he were going on the trip himself, asked Jeremy in excitement,
How high can you fly? Oh, I don't know exactly, Jeremy said. A couple of miles, I guess.
Mother, did you hear? You'll be 2 miles up in the air.
Martin, it won't be necessary to go so high on this trip, Jeremy said cheerfully.
Sorry. Martin, it won't be necessary to go so high on this trip, Jeremy said cheerfully.
No, but I can if you'd like.
No, thank you. I wouldn't think of your taking the trouble. She was trying hard to hide her terror, and Martin had not helped matters at all. But Jeremy suddenly saw that she was trembling and realized that she must be afraid.
It's all right, he said kindly. There's nothing to be nervous about. I fly over the woods a dozen times a day.
Yes, thought Mrs. Frisby, but you're not riding on your back, and you can't fall off. All right, she said as bravely as she could. I'm ready. Teresa and Martin, take care of Timothy until I come back, and be sure you don't tell him where I've gone. With a small leap, she was on Jeremy's back, lying as flat as she could and holding tight to the glossy feathers between his wings, as a horseback rider grips the horse's mane before a jump. Martin and Teresa waved goodbye, but she did not see them, for she had her face pressed against the feathers and her eyes closed. Once again she felt the surge of power as the crow's broad wings beat down against the air. This time it lasted longer, for they were going higher than before. Then the beating became gentler as they leveled off, and then, to her alarm, it stopped altogether. What was wrong? The crow must have felt her grow tense, for suddenly, from ahead, she heard his voice.
An updraft, he said. We're soaring. There's usually one over this stretch of woods in the evening.
A current of warm air, rising from the woods, was carrying them along. So smooth was the motion that they seemed to stand still, and Mrs. Frisby ventured to open her eyes and lift her head just a trifle. She could not look straight down. That was Jeremy's back, but off to the right and a bit behind them she saw a gray-brown square the size of a postage stamp. She realized with a gasp that it was the garden patch, and Martin and Teresa, if they were still there, were too small to be seen.
Look to the left,
said Jeremy, who was watching her over his shoulder. She did, and saw what looked like a wide, fearsome snake, blue-green in color, coiling through the woods. What is it? She asked in wonder.
You really don't know? It's the river.
Oh, said Mrs. Frisby, rather ashamed of her ignorance. She had heard of the river, of course, but had not known that it looked like a snake. She had never been there, since to reach it one had to cross the entire width of the forest. There were advantages to being a bird. In a minute more they had left the updraft, and Jeremy's wings resumed pumping. They went higher, and Mrs. Frisby closed her eyes again. When she opened them, the garden patch had vanished far behind them, and Jeremy, searching the trees below, began a long, slanting descent. Eventually, as he banked sharply, Mrs. Frisby saw off his wingtip a gray-brown patch among a stand of tall green pines. From so high it looked like a gnarled gray bush, but as they circled lower she could see that it was in fact an enormous tree, leafless, skeletal, and partly dead. One huge branch had recently broken off and fallen, and 3 pine trunks lay bent double under its weight. It was a gloomy and primeval spot, deeply shadowed in the gray dusk. Jeremy circled over it one more time, looking at a certain mark 3/4 of the way up the towering main trunk. Just below this spot, another great branch, itself as big as an ordinary tree, jutted out over the tops of the pines, and on this, at last, Jeremy fluttered gently to rest. They were some 10 feet from the main trunk, and Mrs. Frisby could see, just above the place where the branch joined the tree, a dark round hole as large as a lunch plate.
We're here,
Jeremy said in a low voice.
There's where he lives.
Should I get down? Instinctively, Mrs. Frisby spoke in a whisper.
Yes, we've got to walk closer, but quietly. He doesn't like loud noises.
It's so high. She still clung to the crow's back.
But the limb is broad. You'll be safe enough.
And indeed, the limb was almost as wide as a sidewalk. Mrs. Frisby gathered her courage, slithered down, and felt the solid wood under her feet. Still, she could not help thinking about how far it was to the ground below.
"There he is," said Jeremy, staring at the hole. "It's just the right time."
They inched their way along the limb, Mrs. Frisby gripping the rough bark tightly, being careful not to stumble, and as they came closer, she could dimly perceive a shape like a squat vase sitting back in the hollow of the tree. Near the top of the vase, wide apart, two round yellow eyes glowed in the dark.
"He can't see us," Jeremy whispered. "It's still too light."
Perhaps not, but he could hear, for now a deep round voice, a voice like an organ tone, echoed out of the hollow trunk.
"Who is standing outside my house?"
Jeremy answered.
"Sir, I am a crow. My name is Jeremy, and I have brought a friend. I hope we have not disturbed you. My friend needs your advice."
"I see. And can your friend not speak for himself?"
"Sir, my friend is a lady mouse."
"A mouse?"
The sonorous voice sounded unbelieving.
"Why should a crow be friend to a mouse?"
"I was trapped, sir, and she set me free. She saved me from the cat."
"That is possible,"
said the owl.
"though unusual. I have heard of such a thing before. We all help one another against the cat."
"True. And now, sir, my friend herself is in trouble."
"I understand,"
said the owl, moving closer to the round entrance of his hollow.
"Mrs. Mouse, I cannot see you, for the glare of the daylight is too bright. But if you will step inside my house, I will listen to what you have to say."
Mrs. Frisby hesitated. She knew something of the dietary habits of owls, and she did not much like the idea of being trapped in his house. Finally, she said timidly, "Sir, I would not want to intrude, and I can hear you quite well from out here."
"Mrs. Mouse, please understand that I have no interest at all, as a general rule, in helping mice to solve their problems. If you have indeed saved a bird from the cat, I will spare you a few minutes. But I do not discuss problems with people I cannot see. Either come inside or tell your friend to take you home again."
Behind her, Mrs. Frisby heard Jeremy whisper very softly,
"It's all right. He wouldn't harm you in his own home."
She whispered back, "I hope not." She walked up the limb to the hollow, climbed over the sill, and stepped inside. Up so close, the owl looked very large. Each of his feathery feet was tipped with 5 gleaming talons an inch long. His beak was curved and sharp and cruel. He blinked his yellow eyes and said,
"Please, step across the room, away from the light."
Mrs. Frisby did as she was told. As she grew accustomed to the dimness, she looked around her. The chamber into which she had stepped was spacious. At that level, almost half of the huge trunk was hollow and clean, but the floor was extremely rough. It was not really a floor at all, but only the jagged ends of dead wood sticking up from below, like stalagmites in a cave, so that Mrs. Frisby had to climb rather than walk as she crossed the room. In the back, the walls narrowed to a corner, and there she saw that the owl had built himself a nest as big as a water bucket of twigs and leaves. From the top, she could see protruding some wisps of the feathers with which he had lined it. When she got near his nest, she stopped and faced the owl, who had turned from the light of the doorway and was peering at her with his great yellow eyes. Jeremy was nowhere to be seen. She could only hope he was still waiting on the limb outside. "Now," said the owl,
You may state your problem.
Go to the rats? Mrs. Frisby began nervously, trying to arrange her thoughts. It's about my youngest son, Timothy. He is sick, too sick to leave his bed, and moving day is only 5 days off.
Wait, said the owl. Moving from where? Moving to where?
From the garden patch, where we're living, to the edge of the pasture by the stream.
Which garden?
It had not occurred to Mrs. Frisby until now that a bird, flying freely over miles of countryside, would look down on many gardens. It belongs to Mr. Fitzgibbon.
The one with the large stone?
Yes, my house is near the stone.
What makes you so sure moving day will come in 5 days?
Mrs. Frisby told him about the tractor and what Mr. Fitzgibbon had said. 5 days until plowing. Of course, she added, it might turn cold again and freeze or even snow.
No, said the owl, sounding quite sure. It will not. The wild onions are already up in the pastures.
He asked her then what kind of house she had, and exactly what it was in relation to where it was in relation to the big stone. Apparently, he knew the spot well. But the more she talked to him, the more Mrs. Frisby became convinced that he would produce no solution to her problem. It had been foolish of her to think he could, foolish of her to come at all, because, she thought, there really was no solution. At last she fell silent, and the owl asked no more questions. Finally, he said,
lying where it does, your house will inevitably be turned up by the plow and probably broken to bits in the process. There is no feasible way to prevent this. My only advice to you is this. If you stay in the house, you will surely be crushed and killed, all of you. Therefore, it is better to take your chances with moving. Wrap your son Timothy up as warmly as you can, help him as much as possible on the journey, and hope for warm weather on moving day. That way, you are at least sure to save yourself and the other children.
The owl paused, turned away from her, and looked again at the entrance to his hollow. The patch of light, it admitted, was growing steadily dimmer.
And now, if you will excuse me, the night is falling and I have no more time to spare. I regret that I cannot give you a more satisfactory solution to your problem. Good evening, Mrs. He paused. I don't believe you told me your name.
Mrs. Frisby. The poor mouse spoke with a sob in her throat, for the owl had said exactly what she feared he would say, and she had no real hope for Timothy. The owl had said, in effect, either Timothy alone must die, or they must all die together. Even if moving day should be extraordinarily warm, the nights were sure to be frosty, and that would be the end of him. Still, one must be polite, and she added sadly, I thank you, sir, for listening to me. But at the mention of her name, an extraordinary change had come over the owl. He turned back to face her again and stared at her most intently. Indeed, he gave an agitated flutter of his wings and half flew, half hopped closer to her, bending forward until his great sharp beak was only a few inches from her face. Mrs. Frisby shrank back in fear. What had she done wrong?
Did you say Mrs. Frisby?
Yes, you asked my name.
Related to Jonathan Frisby?
Yes, he was my husband. He died last summer. He was Timothy's father. But how did you know about him?
That is not important,
said the owl, drawing back a little and looking at her in a new way, almost as if with deference.
I will say this. His name was not unknown in these woods, and if you are his widow, that puts matters in a different light.
Something in the way he said this caused Mrs. Frisby's hopes to be lifted a little. "What do you mean?" she asked.
I mean, madam, that there is a way that your son's life just might possibly be saved. I did not mention it to you because I saw no way you could conceivably do it, and I did not want to arouse false hope. But if you are Jonathan Frisby's widow, then perhaps it can be done.
"I don't understand at all," said Mrs. Frisby. "What is this thing?"
It is not a thing that I can do myself. You must go to the rats."
"To the rats? I don't know any rats. They have nothing to do with me."
I don't doubt that. They have little to do with anyone except themselves, and will have less as time goes on. Nonetheless, I think they will help you, and if they will, they can.
"But what can they do?"
They must move your house to a place where it will be safe from the plow."
Now Mrs. Frisby's spirits fell again, and she said, almost bitterly, "You are joking, sir. You are not serious. No rat could move my house. It is far too heavy, much too big."
The rats on Mr. Fitzgibbon's farm have things, ways you know nothing about. They are not like the rest of us. They are not, I think, even like most other rats. They work at night, in secret. Mrs. Frisby, do you know the main entrance?
"In the rose bush? Yes."
Go there. You will find a sentry guarding the door. His name is Justin. Tell him who you are and that you come at my request. Tell him that you want to see a rat named Nicodemus. I think they will let you in, though they may insist on swearing you to secrecy. If they should ask that, you must of course use your own judgment, but my advice would be to do as they ask."
Mrs. Frisby was close to complete bewilderment. "Secrecy?" she said. "Secrecy about what?"
"That I cannot reveal. I, too, have agreed to it. Also, there is much I do not know, though I have given advice on certain aspects of their projects."
"Well," said Mrs. Frisby, "I don't understand at all. But if it might save Timothy, I will try to do what you say."
"Tell them," added the owl, "that I suggest moving the house into the lee of the stone. Remember that, the lee of the stone. Also, do not forget the names, Justin and Nicodemus."
"Justin, Nicodemus, the lee of the stone," repeated Mrs. Frisby. "I will remember." She was now so entirely puzzled that she did not think to ask what the phrase meant. Presumably, the rats would know.
"And Mrs. Frisby," said the owl, moving again toward the entrance to the hollow, "please understand, I was an admirer of your late husband, though I never met him in person. I wish you well. I hope your son's life can be saved. You see, I can understand your particular need, for I face a similar problem."
"You?" said Mrs. Frisby. "But you have no moving day."
"I have lived in this tree, in the same hollow," the owl said, "for more years than anyone can remember. But now, when the wind blows hard in winter and rocks the forest, I sit here in the dark, and from deep down in the moor, down near the roots, I hear a new sound. It is the sound of strands of wood creaking in the cold and snapping one by one. The limbs are falling, the tree is old, and it is dying. Yet I cannot bring myself after so many years to leave, to find a new home and move into it, perhaps to fight for it. I too have grown old. One of these days, one of these years, the tree will fall, and when it does, if I am still alive, I will fall with it. With this sad prediction, the owl stepped through his doorway, spread his great wings, and was gone, soaring silently downward into the shadowy woods below. Mrs. Frisby followed him out onto the limb. To her relief, Jeremy was still waiting where she had left him, though not very patiently.
"We must hurry," he said. "It's almost dark. I'm not supposed to be out this late."
Mrs. Frisby, who had the same feeling, climbed on his back, much less afraid now for two reasons. First, she was getting used to air travel. Second, since the woods below them were dark, she could no longer see how far away the ground was.
"He talked to you for a long time," said Jeremy as they flew. "Did he tell you anything that will help?"
"I don't know," said Mrs. Frisby. Since the owl had brought up the matter of secrecy, and had in fact been secretive himself, she was not sure just how much she should tell Jeremy.
"Why don't you know?"
"I mean, he told me some things, but I don't know whether they'll help or not." She decided to counter with a question of her own. "What does 'in the lee' mean?" Jeremy, being like all birds knowledgeable about the wind, knew the answer to that.
"It means the calm side, the side the wind doesn't blow from. When there's a strong wind, you fly up to the barn from the lee, so you don't get bashed into the wall. My father taught me that."
"I see," said Mrs. Frisby, and she became more puzzled than ever. What had the wind to do with it? "He told me," she said finally, deciding it could do no harm, "to go and see the rats."
"The rats?"
Jeremy was startled.
"Well, they don't have anything to do with us."
"I know, but he thought they might help.
"What could they do?"
He thought they might move my whole house, but how they could do it, I can't imagine."
"Oh, I don't doubt that they could," said Jeremy. "Everyone knows, at least all the birds know, that the rats can do things. They're up to something. Nobody is quite sure what. For one thing, they're building themselves a new house way back in the woods over the mountains. They've even made quite a big clearing near it. I'd show you, but it's too dark now. They used to carry food like the rest of us, but now we see them with other things, pieces of metal and bits of machinery, things I can't even recognize. They take them into that rose bush, and what happens to them, I don't know. But the owl knows more than most. I expect he's had some dealings with them. Just the same, I've never heard of their helping anybody but themselves."
"Neither have I, but I'm going to ask them anyway. There isn't anyone else to ask." By the time they reached the garden, it had gone almost completely dark, and Jeremy could not linger. "Good night, Jeremy," said Mrs. Frisby, feeling almost affectionate toward the crow. "Thank you for taking me, and for waiting to bring me back."
"You're welcome," said Jeremy. "If you need me again, just ask. After all, if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here to ask."
And he flew off into the darkness, the last crow to get home that night.